Second week into a series. If you're joining us for the first time, we're walking through a series entitled Following Jesus in a Politically Polarized World. And so I want to start off each week, I'm going to say it again this week, that I'm not here to represent any party or any particular candidate, but to talk about what the title says, what it means for us as followers of Jesus. And there's a significant difference between understanding what it means to follow Jesus according to the ways of the disciples, the apprentices of the system of Jesus' day, and just the idea of following like we'll go where he's leading. There's a real significant difference. We walked a little bit through that last week. But understanding that we participate in a world, we live in a world where we have the opportunity to be governed in a way that is intended to bring order and good for all, and so I'll redefine that in a minute, just so we're understanding where we're coming. So I just want to say that as we go through the series, I'm aware, and hopefully you are, that there are those, a part of our Newsong family, and I'm sure some of you are here, that will vote for one candidate and others that will vote for the other. There will be those who vote for Donald Trump, and there will be those who vote for Kamala Harris. And I want you to know, on behalf of Newsong, you are welcome here regardless of who you choose to vote for, even if it's somebody aside from them. Even if you write your own name in. I don't know if you can do that or not, but so this isn't the space where we're intending to. I don't believe in it, to take a position politically and encourage you to move that direction. My encouragement is to help us understand what it means to follow Jesus and be led by the Spirit in all that we do for the best way that we understand what brings about God's will and God's desire for all creation here. And so this isn't intended to be, if you hear something that you feel like is a political leaning and have an issue with that, please tell me. It's not my intention. I'm really not intending to do that. But I understand that these are tense days, and that's why the series, in a sense, because the polarization that these conversations can bring can go through the roof, and there are families and workplaces and people who care about each other, friends, that seem that at times, or perhaps you're one of those, that have come to a place of impasse of conversation. And so I want us to understand how to engage this in ways that allows us to be who we are, to feel welcome here, and to understand then, as followers of Christ, what it means to walk through this journey together. And so I want to start essentially by saying a couple of things that I mentioned last week as they're sort of fundamental to the lens of the series. And so the first one I would say is this, that we need to be people whose politics is filtered through the lens of Jesus and not the other way around. And so the heart of the series is to teach us what that looks like and what that means. And that's really important. We need to be people whose politics is filtered through the lens of Jesus and not the other way around. And so maybe in an expanded way, I would say the heart of the series is this. The church isn't intended to take its place somewhere on the political continuum between left and the right as it attempts to impact and influence the world. It is an entity altogether different, relying on a different way of living, a different form and expression of power, one that transcends, stands in contrast to, and confounds the categories of left, right, and center. So what I'm attempting to share in these weeks as we move through the series is sort of all coming from that it's not an attempt to paint one side as good as the other, it's sort of ultimately, but to say somewhere, it's easy to say, well, this can land sort of this way, and that's fine. But when the church is fully on one side or the other, it's missing the reality of the depth and profundity of the message of Jesus that transcends what any political system can offer or achieve. So that's kind of where we're staying. So last week, we opened the series talking about, essentially, Jesus' invitation, reminder, prayer for us, for all his people, that we would be of one mind. In other words, that Christ would be center, that he holds it all together, as we sang, that our hearts, our wills, our intentions are always, he is first, he is our king, our allegiance is supremely to him, and every other allegiance that follows after that, and there are some variations of that, follows that. And that's what I mean by that our politics should be filtered through the lens of Jesus. That we be of one mind about that. But at the same time, I spoke about sort of the heart of the kingdom is that there's this unity and diversity, not uniformity, that we can disagree on political issues. But that we maintain the sense of being of one mind, and that is that we are followers of Jesus. He is our king. He will give us what we need, instruction, wisdom, timing, conversation, whatever is needed to navigate a community that we are and is intended to be this way, that's diverse in various ways. That's the intention. That's the kingdom of heaven. Our attempt and the church's attempt should never be to move towards a homogeneous, we all believe exactly the same way kind of life. It's easier to do that. It's just not reality of life. We bring so many different lenses and experiences and ways of seeing and moving in the world, and our role as a community of faith is to understand how to navigate those together, even when there's disagreement, to say, I care for you, I love you, meaning I will your good, I want for you the good that I want for me. That's what it means to love my neighbor. And so even if we disagree, it comes with respect and acknowledging your dignity and your right to see and to have the lens that you bring to it, but to still embrace your capacity and desire to love and follow Jesus as we do this together. Does that make sense? Maybe not. It does, I know. So I want to start today with a statement that Jesus makes in John chapter 18, verse 36. He's before Pilate, and so he's been arrested. He's headed to the cross, and he knows it. And so sort of near the end of this conversation, right before Pilate walks away, Pilate asks him, so are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says this, my kingdom does not belong to this world. If it did, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But for now, my kingdom is not from here. So you have to understand, some of you already know this, but ultimately kingdom isn't really language that we use, and so it could feel like what he's saying is, my kingdom belongs out there in space or in heaven somewhere. It's somewhere out there. It's not from this world, and that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is essentially, this is language of power. At its heart, Jesus is saying, he's revealing the origin and the difference of the nature of power at his disposal. He's saying essentially, you use power a certain way. But my kingdom isn't like that, which is why I'm not calling on my servants to come and start an uprising. My kingdom functions on a different level and understanding of power, where it comes from, and how it needs to be engaged. And so because this is before death and resurrection, he's saying, so it's not here now. In Christ's death and resurrection, Christ comes then. He's in heaven, but he sends the Spirit, and sort of the whole series we just did, the book of Acts, is about receiving power. That Christ is now fully in power, seated in heaven, and that we have access to that power now, understanding how in following him, how do we access it, how do we use it in ways that he would if he were us. That he did when he was here. So the translation, basically, a way of thinking of what he's saying to Pilate here is that every human form of government, every human, not just Pilate's, every human form of government is a power over system. And it has to be. It works according to laws that are necessary for the function of a moving away from chaos and towards sort of order kind of society. Without laws, there's chaos. So the laws there is important. And it's sort of the story of the scriptures. The laws come first with the people of Israel to help us understand how do you live sort of civilly among each other. Certain basics about these things are necessary for us to live in a shared life together. The trouble with the law is it only goes so far. And so two things. One, it has to keep being refined and defined. And so for the Hebrew people, those 10 laws end up becoming 613. Because in this situation, it's just a little different. And so the law has some limitations. The other problem with the law is essentially it sets up a system where there's us and there's them. There's those who keep the law and there's those who break the law. And those who break the law need to receive some kind of essentially punishment or some kind of way of saying you need to alter your behavior, and there are consequences for what you've done wrong when you've broken this law. And that's important and necessary. The way of Jesus handles that sort of in an elevated way, and that's another conversation. But basically, Jesus is saying, so it doesn't work that way. There are consequences to our actions. But the law itself is limited in its ability to actually change the human heart, the will to do the wrong. It deals with the behavior. It doesn't deal with the motive for the behavior. To change the behavior ultimately in a way that's transformative, you have to change the nature, the will, the desire to do wrong. And that's what Jesus comes and does. He's saying to Pilate, we don't work in violence in our kingdom. We work to bring about the kind of people who don't have these struggles and this violence, because we've learned to understand what it looks like to love and serve the other in a way that everybody feels valued, that they belong, they contribute, and we work through how we see and move in the world differently with compassion, with servants' hearts, with clarity and respect and dignity always on the table. So that's a system we live under that way, and it's necessary for an orderly and civil society to be that way. The power over systems that have rules has to be that way because of human nature. And here's the point. But it hasn't always been the case. It's not always been that way. If you were to go with me back to Genesis 1 and 2, which we refer to often, because this is where we see what God reveals as his greatest desire for his creation effort, for humankind and all that is creation. It's humankind created by God and empowered by God to participate in his rule over his creation under his authority and power. That's the picture in Genesis 1 and 2. There is no structure for rule over one another. Think about that. God doesn't give any command or indication that anybody's in charge. Why? Because it's him. And together, whoever we are in this garden, and it ends up just being a couple of them before it all falls apart, the ideal was that ultimately within ourselves, we self-govern by love. But we see, if you follow the scriptures, and you know this, Genesis 3, it falls apart because somebody wants to be in charge. They want their way, and so they rebel against this system of government that God has, where he's God and he is served and everybody else works together for the common good. And now we need some structure. So the whole story begins to move towards then the restoration of God's original purpose and design. And eventually then, God establishes a people through Abraham and his family, his descendants, calls them out from slavery in Egypt, sets up a system of governance different from every other known system. A people living in an exclusive covenant with God that happens in the desert there as they wander, trying to figure out who they are as they're becoming a people for their very first time. And under the leadership of the judges. In other words, the judges come along and God ordains it. It's the judges that will sort of give order and rule, not rule as much as just order to, and reconciling the issues that happen when we're doing life together. So the judges come along, and it's essentially a theocracy. They're not rulers, they're disputers. They settle the arguments of people as they're figuring out how to form and do life together. They don't rule over the people. They help sort of mediate law, but they're all in understanding that it's God that rules, and we serve together, and some have roles to help us settle disputes. Does that make sense? So the laws are meant to understand how to restore and maintain relationships with God and each other, how to be one, as we talked about. So it's the first step in the restoration of his kingdom on earth, moving the story forward. But the human story is a story of falling down and getting up, isn't it? 2 steps forward sometimes, 1 step back. And it's no different for them. So let's pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 8, in verse 5, so Samuel is one of the judges at this time, and he's lived his life, and he's got some sons that are following in the natural progression of things is they would take over for Samuel. When he passes, at some point, they would get the mantle. And so a group of the elders come to Samuel with this statement. They say to him this, "You have grown old, Samuel." I feel his pain, by the way. "And your sons do not administer justice the way that you did. Before things worsen, appoint a king to rule us as other nations have." Now, in the backdrop of that, there's some truth to what they're saying. They've profited from some dishonest deals, some bribes, etc. They're a bit troubled. Samuel wrestles with it and prays, asking God for wisdom about this decision and this request. And God responds with this in verse 7. "Listen to what the people are asking you to do," God says. Which I think the subtext of that is, do you hear what they're really asking? Not just on the surface, but do you hear the motive? The real motive of the demand. It is not a rejection of you, it's a rejection of me and my rule over them. You see, there is this clarity for them that God is the ruler. We don't rule each other. God is the ruler. It's a rejection of me, not of you, God says. Now think about this. Did they say they're rejecting God? No. I mean, what was their complaint? Well, on the surface, they were afraid that Samuel's sons weren't fit to lead them. So they were rejecting them. And again, there's some potential truth to that. Because they are, in many ways, ungodly. They didn't trust them to lead the right way. But just below the surface What they're saying is we don't trust the system. So the natural course of action, which seems anyway, the natural human course of action would be, we need to take control if we want to make sure our nation remains a godly nation. The system itself isn't working, so let's sort of figure out how to adjust this differently and maybe have a system like everybody else has, because we think that'll work better. And this is the subtle reasoning and lure of the power over systems. There's enough system to say, yes, this will help us function better. There's somebody ordained to say these people did it wrong, and here's what they deserve, here are the consequences. It seems to be working for everybody else. There's some good that can come from it, and that's true. It's easy to justify because it appears to achieve the same goal, a godly nation, just in a different way than it has been. So we jump on down to verse 8. Notice why God refers to it as a rejection of him. He says, it's what they've always done. From the day I brought them out of Egypt until today, rejecting me and serving other gods. Which raises a few questions. Did they mention a desire to serve another god or other gods? Why does God draw the conclusion that he does? Or perhaps, how is the desire to be ruled by a king a rejection of God? So we have to get this straight. And to understand, I'll put it this way, even with the best intentions, assuming that they didn't even realize it, the desire to have a king as their ruler is a rejection of God because it represents a transfer of trust from God and the unique ways of his kingdom to human rules and its ways. Which is what? Idolatry. It's the unspoken, God, we don't trust you and the system you've given us. We want to do something different. The transfer of trust, ultimately, this is what God is saying. Not that somehow it's not screwed up, but we want the system to change because the one that we have, we want more control over and participation of to make sure we get the system that we want that works for us. And so there's this transfer of trust that anytime anything in our life that takes the place of God, that we trust more, that we lean into more, that we rely on more for our sufficiency, for our security, for all of our basic needs, for ultimately our life, anything that fills that gap that gets in the way is putting something before God, which is idolatry. And it can be any number of things. Your relationship to your children can become idolatry. If you put your love for them and your care and sort of responsibility, or you're leaning for your own sense of worth and value in them over God's, that's idolatry. It doesn't make you a bad person. It means that it's just not that hard to replace God in some dimension of our life. And that's what he means by serving other gods. You're transferring your trust from me and the system that I gave you to somebody else that you're going to give that role over to. They'll take my place. That's the rejection. And with that one request, the one, listen, and only nation that God has ever chosen to covenant with and to bless so that they would be a blessing to all other nations as a display of his kingdom, the nation of Israel succumbs to the enemy's oldest lie, dating all the way back to Genesis 3. God can't be trusted. Do it your way. Do it your way. There's a better way. Take some control here. Which raises the question, why does their reasoning and request on the surface appear rather sensible or even reasonable? Because it's related to a natural way God designed us to see and engage the world. The enemy's most powerful lies always have some dimension of truth, making it harder to weed through, to see through, easier to sort of take the bait, if you would. It's natural, it's related to a natural way God designed us and engaged us, wired us to see and engage the world. A trait, by the way, that is shared by other aspects of his creation. And yet, in this case, it has a subtle and deceptive twist. But let me come at it this way. Take a look at these and see which one of these creatures, so what is one thing these creatures all have in common? Think about it. At first glance, what is it? Any ideas? They're all cute. That's good. They all have babies? Yes. So those are important things. They're related. It's not the main thing I'm going to go for, which I wasn't expecting you to guess. I'm just sort of giving you sort of an insight. This is headed somewhere. So the picture is essentially we are all these animals were created with specific needs and meaning through the forming of strong attachment and bonds to their caregivers. There's a natural way that God instilled into each of these animals and others a specific way of attaching to their primary caregivers. The elephants, for example, are born blind. Did you know that? They're heavily reliant on their mothers. But in their care, the entire herd participates in their development. It's called alloparenting, where individuals other than biological parents provide care and support. Orcas, one of the most profound mother-baby bonds in the animal kingdom. This attachment lasts for life. Females live with their mothers for life. How'd you like to do that? Some of your parents are afraid your kids are going to want to do that. Chimpanzees, or orangutans, gorillas all have the same sort of innate bonding that happens, mother and child, that's significant. It's naturally built in. Other animals share even more sophisticated attachment mechanisms, one of them called genomic, I think that's the way you say it, genomic imprinting. Certain mammals have that. The baby is born. Take the little gosling there. The little gosling, when that baby gosling is born, it imprints on whatever it sees first. Whether that's mom or human being, it believes it's the maternal caregiver. Some of that imprinting is far more powerful than simply the idea of the bond that forms. The bond is formed, but there's this I don't know what it is about geese or other animals that imprint. Maybe zebras do that, and I can understand that. You can lose mom in a herd pretty easily, or the other way around. Here's what I find interesting about this. These mechanisms for attachment and bonding that are necessary. They're necessary for nurture, security, healthy development, a sense of identity and trust, are part of what's vital for the healthy life of these little animals, of the offspring of these moms. Growing up in communities that also, in some cases, provide support and care as well. It's how God wired them. It's how God wired us. We share that in common. Created to have this internal sense of need for attachment, need for bond to something greater than ourselves that helps orient sort of what leads to the life that is good for me, where I can find that I'm healthy, that it's balanced, that I feel valued, that I belong, that I'm secure. That leads us then to this ultimate trust, to this deepest bond about sort of the source of life and all its means. And so we see this then in a direct relationship in the garden. It's Adam and Eve, and there's nobody in charge. It's God that is clearly then the one who walks with them and provides all they need, and they're aware of that. In the design of the family, then it becomes, and this is common sense, it becomes the role of parents or community, others close by, someone loving to be in that process of the formative years, to help give that same sense of bond, of trust, of forming that there is someone above me that is caring for me, that will provide security, provide the life that I long for, that I need, that I want. That's intended then, ultimately, to point beyond itself in the role of sort of God's design for creation. And so to translate that into the language of the series, it means essentially that ultimately we're in that this bond, this attachment, this need for that is naturally tied to understanding and experience of faith and politics. Let me tell you how. Let me tell you why. Let's define faith. We define faith around here as this. Faith is the readiness to act as if the goodness anticipated in hope is real and reliable. That's what faith is. You can separate that word, if you want to, from religion. Everybody has faith in something. Faith is the readiness to act as if the goodness anticipated in hope is real and reliable. Everyone is driven by a need for security, identity, belonging, for, call it, the good life. And so we'll look to something or someone for that and find someone or something that we put our faith in, our trust in, to help us find that. It's a natural part of how we're wired. Politics we define for this series as how we organize our shared life together for the common good. And so we all share life in community of some kind, even if it's virtual, and are formed by its norms and values, and our experience in community over time reinforces or discourages our trust or our faith in them as to whether they are actually a system or systems that can be relied upon for the life we hope is the good life. Are you seeing the correlation? We all have our trust in something. We all have this need for attachment to a person, a community, a system that says this is how you find the life that in your soul, in your bones, you long for. Where you feel secure, where you know that you belong, where you understand who you are and why you're here, and you're given a path, a way of pursuing that. We have trust in something and we organize our shared life together, leaning towards whatever it is that will provide that for us. That's how we're wired. So let me put it this way. As followers of Jesus, when our faith centers on God as being real and reliable, He's trustworthy, in other words, for the good life. And I don't mean the good life in terms of how you might get defined if you did a poll on the street. I'm talking about the good life as Jesus describes it, good being essentially, it's fulfilling God's intended purpose for you. The Hebrew word for good is tov, which means it accomplishes its purpose. The good life is I'm learning to live the life that God designed for me to live, a life that brings with it love and belonging and security and identity. I understand who I am and why I'm here and my role in just being me in this world. When our faith centers on God as being real and reliable for that life we hope for and pursue, and our formative years are nurtured by parents or family or loving caregivers who affirm and embody that understanding of faith, of trust, and are then followed by an engagement with a community or communities built on and guided by those same truths, then those attachments can fulfill their purpose in guiding us how we continue to find security, purpose, and belonging as we organize our shared life together for the common good and flourishing of all. It's a mouthful. It's just a way of saying faith and politics are a natural part of how we're wired. In the system, in the world we live in, they can be good things. They don't feel that way always to all, and certainly the words themselves are present, that's what I'm looking for, concepts and realities that can be really helpful in our journey. But here's another thing I find interesting about how God wired some animals and us for human attachments, Whether it be an elephant, a cow, a chimp, a human being, our natural first-spawning attachments, in great part, can be redirected, reoriented. As in the gosling that thinks that the first contact it has with a human being, that this must be its mother, the gosling can learn to reorient that to an actual goose. We have capacity to redirect the first attachments, the significant attachments that have shaped us along the way. In the absence of a faith that proves to be real and reliable, whatever you've put your faith in, be it in some form of religion or not, something else, some other system, organization, some other philosophy, some other person, if our community has an understanding of its role and purpose for our shared life together that we don't fully trust, we will naturally look for other people, communities, or systems that we can attach to fulfill those needs. It's just in our nature, which in some cases can be a real blessing. But sometimes it can be deceptively detrimental. So let's go back to the story of Israel's leadership at this point, picking up at verse 19. Take a look at how they're now describing their reasons for their decisions, the true priorities. So verse 19, we have decided we want a king so that we can be like other nations and have a king who will rule us and lead us in battle. This is the real reason. Not that Samuel's sons potentially weren't fit to start with. That may be true. There's enough truth in that to say this is why we want to do it. When it comes down to a discussion is, no, we just want to be like everybody else. We want that system because that gives us some power and control. We can be like them, and then if we go to battle, see, we can win. And now we're back into an us and them world. There's the good guys, there's the bad guys. There's us and there's them. And somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. It's not just about administering justice within our people. It's about, no. We want to live the kind of lives they live. Do you see what's really behind their push for a king? It's not really about the inadequacy of Samuel's son administering justice. They just want a different kind of life. So we may say it this way. They've chosen to redirect their pursuit of their source of identity, security, purpose, and meaning, their primary attachment for those things. Let's redirect that away from the system God gave us to this system that everybody else has. We'll find the lens through which and how we see ourselves primarily being in and moving in this world through this system of kingship rather than through a direct access to the life of God. So they've chosen to make central a secondary attachment to a system that gives them what they want. Power, control over their capacity to define and determine what's in their best interest as everybody else does. And here's the thing. In doing so, they form an unnatural attachment, redirecting their trust away from God as their source of life, nurture, security, identity, and belonging. Not that it can't be helpful, not that it's always evil. It just means it brings with it a built-in limitation that will not allow it to become the thing that the primary attachment to God was intended to be, the source of life that is the good life. The life as God intended them to actually live. And so when they do, intentionally or not, they'll transfer their trust and allegiance to a king and a kingdom who, as we'll see, will seek to conquer and rule others, as kings tend to do, and their kingdoms will begin to take on the king's priorities and perspectives as it ceases to pursue becoming, in Jesus' words to Pilate, a kingdom not from here. And that move, that step is so natural and easy. And we live within systems where we work, thank God, under the authority at times that is beneficial for some. And at times not. At times just and at times unjust. Because it's limited. It's run by people. And so there's an offer and a blessing and a chance to participate in that. But for us, it comes with the awareness as followers of Jesus that it is not and cannot define how we see ourselves primarily. Thus the statement, we need to be people whose politics is filtered through the lens of Jesus and not the other way around. Because it's just easy, not simply to work within it, but to identify with the system and then call that Christian, call that anointed by God. And God only anointed Jesus. When Jesus says that, like I said, he's not saying this kingdom exists in space out there somewhere. He's saying my kingdom doesn't operate like yours. It's why the world isn't as Jesus wants it to be. Because it isn't capable of that. It can be good in many ways, but it's not the final. It's not the primary, can never be the primary source, the primary attachment for our pursuit of the life that is good for me and good for all. But he is indicating that the life, the world as he wants it to be, is coming. His message throughout the Gospels is rethink your way of thinking. Repent is what that means. Rethink your way of thinking about how the world works. For the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's here. It's near. And past his death and resurrection, it is now accessible to all of us. It's here and not yet quite fulfilled, which is why he tells us, here's how you pray. Your kingdom come here and now. Your will be done. That's the same thing, basically. For God's kingdom to come means his will is being done here and now. Rethink your thinking, for the kingdom of heaven is near, a kingdom with the opposite end goal of every other system of human governance, the only kingdom capable of breaking down every wall and division that separates and polarizes, of bringing shalom, this rich, profound Hebrew word that is peace beyond the absence of conflict, that it signifies universal wholeness and flourishing where everyone belongs. Everyone has a space and a place, an identity. Everyone matters. Everyone has a destiny. All are welcome. All have dignity. And it's in reach and accessible now. Next week, what can participation in the political process look like in our day? We don't have kings. We don't, anyway. Some people do. What does it look like in our day through the primary lens of our allegiance to Jesus and the coming of his kingdom, here and now, in a way that transcends the pitfalls of even the most just and fair systems? And like Jesus, defies being defined or limited by the labels right, left, or center. Hope you'll join us. Would you pray with me? Father, we're thankful that you are above all things, that Jesus now, as you've assigned is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, which in the language of its day means it's the ruler of all. We know that. But it's language that signified there is no one that has any more power, no greater power, no greater wisdom, no greater capacity for the rule of all things in this world and beyond. There is no other name under heaven that offers the opportunity for a participating life in the eternal life Jesus offers. It's not a religious thing. It's an experience of a kind of life that fulfills and lifts and unifies regardless of circumstances, bringing wholeness and peace in the midst of the greatest chaos. We long for that. It's just difficult, Father, as in our humanity, we tend to lean in ways and trust in systems, and we need to, Father, find some trust and ability to participate, and we're grateful to do that. But we need to continually, Father, be aware of whether our allegiance is with you and what defines us. We're thankful that you are still available and accessible and walk with us and can guide us as we move through this world, bringing about your kingdom. We thank you for the joy of participating in that. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.